I want you to be inspired by Gabby. That's what we're looking for. That's something that I want to see. If there's a trip that you guys want to take it now. Do it now while you got it. If there's a relationship that you're in that might not be the best thing for you, leave it now.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Well, it's a solemn day today. It's a sad day. Today, Gabby's remains were laid to rest, and you heard Gabby's father speaking at the beginning of this clip. In this episode, we're actually going to be addressing the point that he made and seeing that it's not necessarily quite so simple to just leave. And we're going to try and answer the question why she didn't leave. But before we get to that, let's observe 22 seconds of silence. 1 second for each year of Gabby's short life. Although Joe Petito, Gabby's biological father, said we should celebrate her life, we shouldn't be sad, I do think it is appropriate that we grieve, that we mourn, and that we acknowledge this tragedy. And I'm going to be speaking a little bit more about the funeral, but also the psychological life of Brian in a live stream at 6 p.m., about 2 to 3 hours from now. So look out for that. I'll be talking a little bit more about the live stream at the end of this video. I also want to thank those of you who've subscribed to the channel in the last couple of days. If you haven't subscribed, please do like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So I recently made the point that in true crime, some obvious things are obvious, but sometimes the obvious doesn't seem obvious at all. And I wonder whether this funeral isn't an example of that, where certain obvious things that have happened, Gabby was murdered. That is something to be really shaken up about and devastated about. And does it feel like that has happened? But let's go to something else. Is Brian Laundrie a nerd or an outdoorsman? Is he hiding indoors or outdoors? Is he near his home somewhere in Florida or halfway to New Zealand? When Brian is caught, as I'm sure he will be, the answer, when it comes, will feel obvious. Something else about the funeral, Brian is a central reason why Brian is a very real reason why Gabby's gone, and yet Brian isn't mentioned at the funeral. Nothing really of note, I thought, was really mentioned. And what are funerals about? They're also about acknowledging a life, and they're about finding meaning in a particular situation. And I think it does a service to someone to find real meaning in a situation, right? So how do we do that? Well, I think it is by asking this question: why Gabby towed the line with Brian? At great cost to herself ultimately. And so in this episode, we are going to ask and try to answer that question authentically. Why didn't Gabby just leave him? And I thought that Joe kind of oversimplified it to some extent. Sometimes it can be as simple as that, but I don't think it was in this case, right? And this question comes up every time. It's a question folks have been asking. The question that seems to come up in every true crime case of late. It came up in the Watts case, in the Morphew case, and it's back here in the Petito case. Why didn't Gabby just leave him? Those other cases I've referenced should, I hope, give you some pause, that the obvious question should be more than just a rhetorical question. It deserves an answer. It deserves us looking at the answer and spending a little bit of time on it. But while the answer is fairly obvious, it's not that obvious to many of us. It certainly wasn't obvious to me until now. Now, knowing what we know about the Watts case, how do we answer that question? Well, it wasn't just one thing, was it? In the Watts case, there were money issues, there were issues of control, there was the need to maintain appearances, there was an affair, and there was Watts's personality. Are you able to say today what the main reason was why Chris Watts didn't, quote unquote, just leave Shanann, or why Suzanne Morphew didn't, quote unquote, just leave Barry? There are answers to these questions, but the bottom line isn't really what we think, but what they thought. And what they thought was, as much as they needed to break off the relationship, I'm sure Gabby knew that herself many times, not just on the summer epic, but even before that. But for whatever reason, although she knew she needed to break it off, she couldn't. These other individuals I've mentioned, they couldn't. We may not think they have good or valid reasons for not moving on, but they did. They had reason to fear, and the fact that all three of these cases end in murder shows they had good reason to fear, because the driving forces surrounding their dynamic were serious. They were significant. So I'm going to give you a chance to think about the answer yourself. I don't want to just sort of kind of make a sermon. I want you guys to try and come up with the answer. And so how we're going to do that is, let me rephrase the question. Why didn't Gabby just leave him? So how we're going to do that is we're going to approach the answer by ticking off two other boxes on our way to the third, and likely, I think, the most important box. On the way, perhaps even before we get to the third box, you may find the not so obvious answer suddenly revealing itself as quite obvious after all to you.
Worth playing for?
Yeah.
Yes.
So, box number 1, Gabby had quit her job. If a dependency scenario is going to be triggered, one surefire way to do that is to quit your job. It does look like Gabby was the financial powerhouse of the two, which is why there's a warrant out for his arrest. And look what it's for, bank fraud, using her card. And he used her card sometime between August 30th and September 1st, and that's a very short time since she was, so to speak, out of the picture, right? Now, Brian wouldn't need to use her card or need her money if he had his own. Money will likely turn out to be a major lever of control Brian didn't have a handle on until August 30th. But from Gabby's perspective, quitting the relationship wasn't necessarily a rational option, especially because of box number 2. Box number 2 is Gabby was invested in a new career at the time that this happened. Because Gabby had quit her job, she needed a new one. Because Gabby had quit her job, she was invested in this new idea, this new adventure, this new career trajectory. That was where her focus was. She was hoping that that would be his focus as well. Unfortunately, all of that was to some extent also codependent on Brian. Brian needed to be there. Brian needed to show up. Brian needed to participate in this project. Brian needed to drive. Brian needed to take photos. Brian needed to help Gabby make a living. Brian needed to help Gabby make a living. And of course, simultaneous to that, Brian would sort of be helping himself if he made a success out of it. It was their baby in a way. Brian also needed to make a living. He just didn't want to be a pawn, I think, in Gabby's career. And no one really wants to be. So that's fair. But I mean, what else was he going to do? So maybe she needed him, but after he'd exposed this other side of Brian, did she still want him? But even in a situation like that, well, I need you, but I don't really want you. After this is done, after I'm set up, I'm going to discard you. Well, didn't he try to beat her to the punch? And I must say that is such an unfortunate choice of words, given what probably did happen here. And as for Brian, what is Gabby doing? She's sort of doing the whole Instagram thing, the whole social media thing, which can feel artificial, shallow, and superficial. Did Brian want to be with someone so shallow and superficial? Did he want to be with a content creator taking fake happy selfies every third day? And because Gabby had quit her job, needed money, needed to make a success of this new job, needed to make money out of this adventure, because she'd bought the van out of her own pocket, she wanted to make it work. And she thought Brian was going to be a part of that, and that would be the simple and easy part. Instead, it was the complicated part. It was the difficult part.
Sorry if I'm in a bad mood. I've just been really stressed. I had so much work I was doing on my computer this morning.
What do you do for a living?
Well, I used to work at an organic juice bar, but I just quit my job.
Okay.
I was a nutritionist. That was my
That's
job.
cool.
And I just quit my job to travel across the country. And I'm trying to start a blog. I have a blog and stuff. So I've been building my website. So I've just been really stressed. And he doesn't really believe that I could do any of it. So that's kind of been like I don't know, he's like down there. I don't know.
So there you have it in her own words. She's working, she's stressed, she's kind of really, working so hard that it's actually putting her in a bad mood. And he's being complicated and difficult, a downer, critical, not believing in her, moody, temperamental, abusive, controlling, manipulative, and finally, it looks like, jealous. And we know that he was a jealous person anyway, certainly from Rose Davis. Now, you might imagine all of that might add up to a final straw with Gabby. And it would have, were it not for box number 3. Have you thought about what it is? This is the critical reason Gabby couldn't just leave Brian. Box number 3 is Gabby's home was Brian's home. Gabby had been living in Brian's parents' home for 2 years. Their home and his home was her home. Her home was far from her original support network, and the van life was even further. Now, bear in mind, it's not just that Gabby's home was Brian's home, it's the preceding 2 points as well. It's the new career move. It is her quitting her job. It's the money issues. But ultimately, underneath all of this, foundationally, the issue is that she won't have a home if they break up. It may have occurred to Gabby to trade Brian's parents' home for the van life. In other words, to turn the transit van into kind of a full-time home, as some content creators have done and are doing, right? But if Gabby expressed interest in this, Brian may have balked at it. It would mean goodbye to his comfy bedroom, home-cooked meals, laundry done by mom, cooking by mom, cable television, all that for this. The problem was, if Brian ducked out of the van life, Gabby would have to as well. But Brian ducking out of the van life would mean both of them would now be out of a job, and it would be back to Wabasso Avenue, starting from scratch, trying to scrabble a living all over again. Brian saw nothing wrong with that, but Gabby, having invested so much, probably felt differently. She didn't want to give up. If they were going to get married, they were going to need to grow, evolve, improve to the next level. Brian probably wanted things to stay the same. The van life was a way to do that, to grow, evolve, improve, expand, change. But Brian wanted to regress and luxuriate in the comforts of Wabasso Avenue. If Brian wasn't part of the equation, van life wasn't going to be an option, and that would mean going back home to Brian. The way Brian may have seen it, he had no resources, no real resources in the van life situation. And in that situation, they were rubbing up against people all the time. He was forced to socialize in a way, and he wasn't very good at it. And Gabby's money was quickly running out. Probably he recognized that as well. If she wasn't careful, this was going to be a one-way trip. At least Wabasso Avenue allowed him to borrow resources Gabby didn't have, and he could indirectly offer her full board and lodging. In the van life scenario, all he could offer was misgivings. So let's put the question up again and see how well the answer fits. Why didn't Gabby just leave him? If Gabby left him, she would lose her home. And at 22, that was a bridge too far, given that she was also unemployed, and this is all in the middle of a pandemic. Is that obvious enough for you? In the end, it really isn't such a long walk in the park, is it? Have a look at this image of Brian's parents. Just think a little bit about what it was like living there day to day. What was their relationship with Gabby? What was their relationship with Brian? What was their feeling about them being a couple? What was Brian's father's relationship like with Gabby? What was Brian's father's relationship with Brian? What was Brian's mother's relationship with Gabby and with her son? If you still have doubts about the codependency narrative in this story, it's not just about Gabby living with Brian, it's about Brian living with his parents while thinking that they were ready to get engaged. Well, were they? It's really a codependency built onto a codependency, right? It's Gabby and Brian living with Brian's parents, not just Brian. That means Gabby effectively has 3 Brians to answer to. We all know how doting mothers can be about their sons and how disapproving they can be about potential daughters-in-law, even if they don't mean to be. And this can be quite hard for that potential daughter-in-law. It can constrain their freedom. You might have a son, well, not a son, Brian, feeling like, I'm not really sure I want to do this, and then the mother supporting that, and that interfering with the relationship. And this protection of Brian, which feels like it remains ongoing, doesn't it? Regardless of Gabby's death. It may well have been evident earlier in those 2 years. It may have been part of the fabric of staying in that house. And Brian probably didn't want to let go of that protection, that support, and yes, coddling. The van life would mean letting go of a lot of that. And look what happened. Look at the Moab incident. Brian probably felt unprotected. Same thing at the Tex-Mex restaurant. Unprotected. No one to spoil him, and so he's vulnerable, exposed, and not getting along very well with people. Brian doesn't have any friends, so the soft, warm bosom of home is a lot more comforting than the discomforts beyond, aren't they? In hindsight, Brian should have been encouraged to get a life and get a proper job, and then, once that was in place, get engaged. But he wanted to have his cake and eat it, and I think that shows in the way this case is manifested thus far. Brian wants to control someone but be free himself. He wants to commit a crime but be allowed to be free and live life on his own terms. He wants to be engaged but also call the shots. He wants it both ways. And because of that, right now he's on a highway somewhere running away from reality. Because you can't still live at home and think you can call the shots on anything. You first have to make something of yourself. You first have to become someone. And once you're somebody, then you can realistically call a couple of shots. Well, guess what? Right now, Brian is becoming who he really is. Really, really quickly. Not only is Brian fleeing from his own reality, he's fleeing into his own reality. And if you don't know how that kind of schizophrenia works, go ahead and watch Fight Club. Watch the movie. So I'm not going to take it any further than that, certainly not in this episode. I'm going to be doing a live stream in a couple of hours from now where we're going to open the can of worms that is the psychological life of Brian. We're going to do that using the incredible Pulitzer Prize winning Ernest Becker. So we're going to study, analyze, figure out the psychological life of Brian through Becker. If you've got any questions and comments, including about the funeral, we'll be talking about that at about 6 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.